Some would say, I screwed Bret Hart. Bret Hart would definitely tell you, I screwed him. I look at it from a different standpoint. I look at it from a standpoint of the referee did not screw Bret Hart. Shawn Michaels certainly did not screw Bret Hart. Nor did Vince McMahon screw Bret Hart.
January 2024, a former WWE employee filed a federal lawsuit. The lawsuit made very serious claims against Vince McMahon, claims about how he treated people who worked. Soon after the lawsuit became public, several big sponsors started pulling away from the company very quickly. TKO, the new owner of WWE, moved fast to push him out for good. The man who had controlled pro wrestling decades was suddenly gone from the company he built with his own two hands after so many years very top. And as this story starts to unfold, use the hype feed and give this video some hype, because stories like this only get told when people help push them forward. That ending did not come out of nowhere. In January 2025, the SEC, the agency that watches over public companies in America, fined Vince McMahon more than $1 million. The reason was simple. He had not told the truth about secret payments he had made over payments meant to keep certain quiet. This was not just the end of a career. It was the final piece of a much longer, much darker story. One that stretches back across 40 years. Millions of fans from America to the United Kingdom and far beyond had known his face for decades, cheering against him, booing him, tuning in every single week without fail. By the time of that fall, the company Vince McMahon had built was worth billions of dollars. Had television deals around the world. It had stadiums filled with fans chanting his name or booing him depending on the night. For most of his life, that kind of success would have seemed impossible to imagine for the boy he had once been. But the way he got there and the way it all ended are tied together far more closely than most fans realize. Most fans know the character called Mr. McMahon. He was loud. He was mean. He was the boss. Fired people on live television just to get a reaction from the crowd. For years, fans booed him, cheered against, and laughed at how over the top. It was great television. It made him one of the most recognizable villains in the world, even to people who had never watched a wrestling match in their lives. 5 things, once you know them, change the way every one of those famous moments looks when you watch it back day. But the real Vince McMahon was different from that character. The people who worked closest to him for years and years, the writers, the wrestlers, the producers, say he was someone they truly feared. Not the version on television. The real one, behind the curtain, in meetings nobody saw and decisions nobody questioned out loud. This video will show you 5 things most fans do not know about Vince McMahon. Some of these stories played out in front of cameras, hiding in plain sight the whole time. Some happened completely behind closed doors, only coming out years later. All of them help explain how he built WWE into a global empire, how the very same forces that made him powerful eventually helped destroy everything built. Putting these 5 things together does not erase what Vince McMahon achieved, but it does change how that achievement should be understood and what it actually cost the people standing closest to him the whole time. To understand how it all started, we need to go back to the very beginning. Before WWE, before the money, before the fame. Back to a trailer park in North Carolina where none of this seemed even remotely possible. Vince McMahon grew up genuinely poor. His family did not have much money, and his early life was far from safe. He lived with his mother and a string of stepfathers, and some of those men were cruel. One stepfather, named Leo Lupton, beat his mother. When young Vince tried to step in and protect her, Lupton turned on him too, beating him as well, again and again. Later in life, Vince McMahon also spoke publicly about even darker things from his childhood. He talked about deep hurt that happened inside his own home when he was a boy. Hurt that went far beyond ordinary family problems. Were not small things to carry. They were the kind of experiences that shape a person for the rest of their life, often in ways that person's never fully escape, no matter how successful they become later on. Until he was 12 years old, Vince McMahon did not know his real father. He did not even know his own last name. His biological father, also named Vincent McMahon, was a complete stranger to a man living a separate life in a separate world, running a business his son knew nothing about. This kind of childhood teaches a hard lesson, and it is a lesson that stays person for life. People around you cannot be trusted safe. The ground beneath can shift at any moment without warning. If you want to survive, you have to control everything yourself, because nobody else will protect. That lesson never left him, not for the rest of his life, and it shaped almost every major decision he would go on to make. Even decades later, when he had more money and more power than almost anyone in the wrestling business. That same instinct never went. He still needed to know what was coming next, and he still needed to be the one who decided. When young Vince finally met his father, he was brought into a world that felt cold and distant. His father ran a wrestling promotion that covered the northeastern part of America. Instead of welcoming his son into the family business with open arms, his father pushed him away. He told Vince to get a normal government job, something steady, something safe, with a pension waiting at the end of it, far away from the unpredictable world of wrestling. So for years, Vince did work that meant nothing to him. He operated adding machines in an office. He sold paper cups for a living. He drove dump trucks at a stone quarry, doing hard, dusty, unglamorous work day after day. None of it fit the picture he had of who he wanted to be. None of it brought him any closer to the world his father had kept him out. Eventually, his father gave him a small chance, though it did not feel like much of a gift at the time. He sent Vince to run the wrestling business in Bangor, Maine, the smallest and poorest part of the entire promotion, an area other promoters had mostly given up. His father was blunt about what this meant. It was Vince's first chance, and his father made it very clear it would also be his last. Vince did not fail. He pushed hard into towns nobody else had bothered, running shows in places the older promoters ignored. For years, betting on areas that everyone else thought were a waste of time. He worked relentlessly, and over time, a small corner of the business grew until it made up half the entire promotions. His father could no longer treat him like an after. He had no choice but to take him serious. In 1982, Vince bought the company outright from his father and the other shareholder who held up. He paid more than $1 million for the whole thing, huge sum at the time. His father believed the sale would keep the old way of doing things in place, a system where different wrestling promotions controlled their own region and respected each other's territory, almost like an unspoken agreement between gentlemen who had known each other for decades. He was wrong. The moment Vince owned the company, he set out to tear that old system down completely, piece by piece. His father later said, in plain terms, I never would have sold the business if he had known what his son planned to do with it. But Vince's plan worked exactly as he hoped. Within just a few years, the old territory system was dead. For the first time in the history of professional wrestling, one man controlled the business on a national level, broadcasting into living rooms across the entire country, and that man was Vince McMahon. This was not just a smart businessman, even though it made him incredibly wealthy almost overnight. It came from somewhere much deeper than money. Child, Vince had learned that anything outside his control could hurt him badly, sometimes without warning. Buying the company and crushing the old system that his father loved was that same childhood lesson, just played out on a much bigger stage, with much higher stakes, and with an entire industry as the prize. Even the choice to buy out his own father, a man who had kept him at arm's length for most of his life, fit this same pattern. Ownership meant control, and control meant safety. To understand why Vince acted the way he did, you have to understand where he came. Now let's talk about the first of our 5 things. This one is about what life was really like behind the curtain at WWE, far away from the cameras and the cheering crowds. In offices and hallways, public never saw. For decades, people who worked backstage at WWE described the same feeling over and over again: constant fear. Writers, producers, and wrestlers all say they never truly knew where they stood, no matter how long they had been there or how successful they had been before. One week, you could be the most important person in the entire building, treated like a star, given the best storylines and the most attention. The next week, with no warning at all, you could become nothing, pushed to the side without a word. This fear was not just an accident of a stressful business. It worked like a tool, almost like a management strategy. If Vince McMahon praised someone on a Monday night broadcast, calling them out by name as the future of the company, that very same person could be quietly cut from the show by Friday, with no warning, no meeting, and no explanation given to anyone, including the person themselves. Nobody really knew why these changes happened, and almost nobody dared to ask, because asking could make things worse. Writers say they were often given instructions that made no logical sense All instructions that contradicted everything they had been told just days earlier, and they followed them anyway, without question. Nobody wanted to be the person who pushed back, even gently, even with good reason. Longtime staff describe a workplace built around total compliance, where employees would carry out strange, logical ideas rather than risk confronting a man known for his temper and his absolute power over their job. This constant back and forth, praise one day, punishment the next, kept everyone permanently on edge year after. Nobody ever felt settled enough to relax, even after years on the job, even after proving themselves again and again. And when nobody feels safe in their positions, almost nobody is willing to challenge the person standing at the very top, no matter how wrong something seems. One of the clearest examples came in February 1997. Shawn Michaels, one of WWE's biggest and most talented stars, gave an emotional speech on live television. He said, with tears in his eyes, that he had lost his smile. He said he could no longer perform because of a serious knee injury, and he gave up his spot in the main event of WrestleMania, one of the biggest shows of the entire year, the kind of spot most wrestlers spend their whole careers trying to reach. To the public watching at home, this looked like a sad, simple story about an injured star stepping aside with honesty and emotion. But backstage, the real story was far more complicated than anything shown on screen. Michaels and his biggest rival, Bret Hart, were locked in a real, ugly, personal feud that had spilled out of the storylines and into real life, away from the camera. At one point, during a backstage argument, Hart had actually grabbed and pulled hair from Michaels' head. Michaels later said the environment around him had become unsafe and that he no longer felt comfortable in the building. Michaels also had a close, friendly relationship with the people running the company, a relationship that other wrestlers noticed and resented quietly, never saying anything out loud. He often received special treatment that was visible even to fans watching on television. Small things that added up over time. People in the locker room believed that his sudden knee injury and his emotional retirement speech timed perfect to avoid a match he did not want. A match where he would have had to lose the championship to Bret Hart in front of the whole. Instead of dealing with this direct by enforcing rules or demanding answers from one of its biggest stars, the company simply went along with what Michaels wanted. He kept his spot. He avoided the match. This sent a clear, quiet message through the entire locker room. A message everyone understood without anyone having to say it out loud. The rules were not the same for everyone. If you were close enough to top, the rules could bend just for you, no matter how everyone else felt about it. This was not just one wrestler getting special treatment for one moment. It was a pattern that repeated itself years, with different names, different eras, but the same basic shape every single time. Some people were protected, no matter what they did. Most people were not, no matter how hard they were. And almost everyone backstage understood, without ever being told directly, which group they belonged. But if that level of control sounds like enough, it's until you hear what happened the one time someone told Vince no to his face and actually meant it. Brings us to the second thing on our list. This is the story of the Montreal Screwjob, one of the most talked about moments in the entire history of professional wrestling. But the public version of this story, the one fans have heard for years, is not the full truth, not even close. In late 1996, Bret Hart signed a huge new contract with WWE, one that was supposed to last an incredible 20 years. It was a deal built on trust, the kind of contract that promised security for the rest of his career, the kind of deal almost nobody in wrestling had ever been off for. Less than a year later, the company told Hart that it was in serious financial trouble. They asked him to take a massive pay cut, slashing his weekly earning $30,000 by more than half, a huge drop for someone who had just signed a deal meant to last 2 decades. Hart felt the company was breaking its word to him, breaking a promise he had built his entire future around. So he started talking to a rival world championship wrestler, known to fans as WCW, a company actively trying to beat WWE in the rating every single. And remarkably, WWE actually encouraged him to take that off, seeing it as a way to solve their financial problem. But there was one enormous problem hiding underneath all of it, a problem that would change everything. Bret Hart left WWE while still holding the WWE Championship belt, and then walked out onto WCW live television show holding that very belt it would be a public disaster for WWE, handing their biggest rival free moment of television gold. To Vince McMahon, this was not just embarrassing. It felt like a direct attack on the credibility, everything he had spent his life building, a wound that could not be allowed to happen under any circumstance. Hart's contract gave him the right to have a say in how his final weeks play out, including a guaranteed period of creative control, a rare protection for any performer. He used that right to refuse one specific thing. He would not lose the championship to his rival, Shawn Michaels, in a match held in Canada, his own home country, in front of his own fans, people who had supported him his whole career. Behind the scene, a small group of people met quietly in a hotel room in Montreal, away from anyone who might object. This group worked out a way around Hart's refusal, planning every detail in advance. The plan involved Gerald Briscoe and Robert Remus, a performer known to fans as Sergeant Slaughter, both trusted by the office. One person was deliberately left out of these conversations entirely. Pat Patterson, a longtime and trusted WWE executive, was kept completely in the dark because everyone knew how close he was to Bret Hart, and they could not risk him warning his friend. The referee for the match, a man named Earl Hebner, was told about the plan only a few hours before it happened, leaving him almost no time to process what he was being asked to do. He was placed under enormous pressure to go along with it, with very little time to think things through or raise any objections of his own. During the match, at the exact moment that had been carefully planned in advance, the referee called for the bell while Hart was locked in a submission hold. Hart had not actually given up. He had not tapped out and had no intention of doing so. But the match was declared over anyway. Instantly, Hart lost the champion in exactly the way he had specifically said would not allow, in front of the entire arena. What happened next was chaos. Hart spat directly at Vince McMahon from inside the ring, in front of thousands of stunned fans. He smashed equipment at ringside in anger, throwing things across the area. Then, backstage, away from the camera, he confronted McMahon face to face into the locker room area, with emotions running as high as they could possibly go. For years, the official story told to fans was that McMahon offered Hart a free punch, chance to get his anger out and settle things down peacefully between two professionals. But people who were actually there tell a very different story. They say Hart hit McMahon hard, a real full-force punch, knocked him out cold for several long minutes. McMahon simply sat there, dazed and silent, while the people around him stood frozen, nobody quite sure what to do or say next. What Vince reportedly said afterward shows exactly how he thought, even in a moment like that, flat on the floor with a black eye forming. According to people who were present, he said he had let it happen on purpose. He claimed he took the punch deliberately to protect Shawn Michaels and another wrestler, Triple H, from being attacked by an angry, betrayed locker room looking for anyone to blame for what had just happened. The very next morning, Vince McMahon went out and did interviews and television taping as if nothing at all had happened the night before. He covered the bruise on his face with makeup, hiding the evidence in plain sight. He gave a now famous speech, looking directly into the camera, where he said that Bret screwed Bret, turning the entire incident into a storyline almost overnight and using it to launch the most successful version of his on-screen character. The Montreal Screwjob cost Vince his biggest star, a man who had given the company over a decade of loyal service. It split his locker room in two, some performers furious at what had happened and others remaining loyal to the office no matter what. And it gave him a real black eye, literally, in front of the whole world watching. But more than anything, it showed exactly how far he was willing to go when he felt his control slipping away from him, even for a moment. Bret Hart did eventually leave for WCW, just as everyone had expected before the Screwjob happened. But he left as a man who felt deeply betrayed by the company he had given so much of his career to, rather than leaving on his own terms, with his head held high and his title intact. Now for the third thing on our list. This one is about something most fans never connect to control at all. Something hiding in plain sight every single week, right in front of millions of. It is about Vince McMahon's body. Most company bosses show off their power through money, through lawyers, through fancy titles and corner off. Vince McMahon showed his power through muscle, through sheer physical presence, walking among the very athletes. People who worked with him for years say they were genuinely shocked the very first time they saw him without a shirt on. His body looked like it belonged to one of the wrestlers on the roster, not the man signing the checks in an office upstairs, the man making business decisions worth millions of dollars. This was not an accident, and it was not simple vanity. It was part of how he ran the entire company day after day. Even as he got older, Vince trained like a professional athlete, sometimes harder than the athletes he employed and paid. He would work out at 2 in the morning after a long, exhausting night of television tapes that had already drained everyone else in the building, running on just 4 or 5 hours of sleep before doing it all again the very next day. He pushed his body harder than most people half his age, year after year, with no signs of slowing down, no matter how the rest of his life looked. This mattered enormously backstage, in a locker room filled with huge, athletic, often genuinely dangerous men, many of them former athletes or fighters in their own right. Vince would challenge wrestlers to arm wrestling matches on the spot, sometimes without warning. Challenge them to wrestle him on the floor for fun, in front of other people watching. But these were never really jokes, not to him, for a single moment. He needed to win every single time, and people around him noticed exactly how serious he took it, far more serious than the situation seemed to call for. There are stories of Vince getting physical with the former Olympic wrestler Kurt Angle on company plane mid-flight with nowhere for either man to go. There are stories of him wrestling Kofi Kingston on a locker room floor between segments of a live show while everyone else carried on around. He even challenged Zach Gowen, a wrestler who has only one leg, to arm wrestling contests, refusing to treat the moment as anything other than a real competition that he intended. This need to look strong, to be physically dominant in every room he entered, was also tied directly to the biggest legal threat the company ever faced. In 1994, the United States government put Vince McMahon on trial in federal court, a trial that could have ended everything he had built. Prosecutors said he had helped supply anabolic steroids to his wrestler, building a roster of men who looked bigger, stronger, more impossible than any normal human body naturally become without help. Investigators found that one doctor, George Zahorian, had given steroids to dozens of professional wrestlers, the vast majority of them working for Vince's company at the time, a number that would have looked very bad in front of a jury. But a tip-off made by phone from a longtime company executive named Pat Patterson allowed Zahorian to destroy important records before investigators could get hold of, removing evidence that could have been used at trial. During the trial, Hulk Hogan, one of the most famous stars in wrestling history, took the stand in front of the jury. He testified that Vince had never told him to use steroids and had never sold them to him personally. His answers were careful, quiet, and noticeably restrained for someone with such a larger-than-life public personality, someone usually impossible. Case against Vince fell apart for another reason too, one that nobody could have predicted. The government's main witness, a man named Kevin Wackles, who had wrestled under the name Niles, clearly hated Vince McMahon on a deep personal level, showed the moment he opened his mouth. Under questioning from Vince's defense lawyer, Wackles' anger came through so strongly, so openly, the jury stopped trusting anything. In the end, Vince McMahon was found not guilty on every single charge against him. Think for a moment about what that trial meant to a man who had grown up powerless inside an abusive home with no control over his own safer child. He had built a body that made him look unbeatable to everyone around him, a wall of muscle nobody could see through. Then he survived a federal trial that could have ended with him in prison for years, walking away completely free. After surviving all of that, after beating odds that should have crushed him, it would have been very easy for him to start believing that the normal rule simply did not apply to him anymore. Not really, not in the way they applied to everyone else. For Vince, his body was never really about looking good for the camera, even though the cameras loved it. It was about power, plain and simple, the same kind of power he had been chasing since he was a child. Inside WWE, power was everything that mattered, more than storylines, more than ratings, more than anything else. After the trial ended, this culture did not disappear. If anything, it grew stronger because everyone backstage had just watched their boss survive something that could have ended everything and walk away looking looking stronger than before, exactly as he had before stepping into that courtroom. Now, fourth thing on our list. This one is about what happened to people, talented, important people, who got on the wrong side of Vince McMahon, sometime without even realizing it had happened. There is a big difference between a normal business and a personal grudge that follows someone for years quietly in the background. Inside WWE, when someone crossed Vince on a personal level, punishment was rarely loud or dramatic, even though the company had no shortage of loud, dramatic moments on television. There was no big announced public firing in front of the camera for the fans to see and talk about online. Instead, people inside the company describe something they call the silent burial, a phrase that came up again and again, different stories, different. A wrestler would simply disappear from the show. They would stop appearing on television week after week with no explanation given to anyone, including their closest friends backstage. They would be left off the schedule for live events in city after city, quietly removed from lists nobody outside the office ever saw. Writers and producers would simply be told that a certain name was off the card and that no further questions about it were welcome, even out of simple curiosity. For the wrestler on the receiving end, this was often worse than being fired outright in a strange and painful way. If you get fired, at least you know exactly where you stand and you can start planning your next move immediately. You can move on, find work somewhere else with a clear conscience and a clear story to tell. A silent burial gave nothing at all to hold on. No closure, no real explanation, just silence, stretching on for months or even years, leaving people stuck in limbo. Two stories show just how far this pattern could go and how deeply personal it could become when the wrong line was crossed. The first is about Lex Luger. In the early 1990s, after Hulk Hogan left the company for a while, WWE spent a fortune trying to turn Lex Luger into the next big patriotic hero for American audiences, hoping to repeat the magic that had worked so well before. They even built him his own custom branded tour bus called the Lex Express, drove it across the entire country as part of a massive promotional push designed to make him a household name overnight. But it simply did not work the way the company had hoped, no matter how much money was spent trying to force it. Luger never captured the world champion, and fans never connected with him the way Hulk Hogan had connected with audiences for years before him, despite all the similarities the company tried to draw between them. By 1995, his formal contract had quietly expired, and he was working under nothing more than a handshake agreement, with nothing written down on paper at all. Without telling anyone at WWE in advance, Luger secretly signed a deal with WCW, the rival company that had been growing fast and stealing talent. He showed up live, completely without warning, on the very first episode of WCW's flagship Monday night show, a program called Nitro that was specifically designed to compete head-to-head with WWE. Vince McMahon found out about this at the exact same moment as ordinary fans watching at home on their television with no advance notice at all. Public statements. The company acted like they did not particularly care, presenting an image of calm business as usual to the press and to fans. But behind closed doors, the reaction was reportedly furious, far more emotional than anything shown to the public. People close to the situation say that Linda McMahon, Vince's wife and a key business partner in the company, was especially angry about what had happened, perhaps even more than Vince himself. The family had invested heavily in Luger's career, both personally and financially, treating him almost like an extension of the family business, and his sudden exit felt like a deep personal betrayal rather than a normal business. For years and years after, Luger's contributions to the company were quietly minimized and written out of the company's own official history, almost as if he had never been there at all. The second story is about the Ultimate Warrior, a wrestler whose real name was Jim Hellwood. His relationship with Vince McMahon was a constant, exhausting battle over money, contracts, and trust, same conflict repeating itself again and again with no real resolution. Before SummerSlam in 1991, Hellwig handed Vince a handwritten ultimatum, a letter laying out his demands in plain, direct terms with no room for negotiation. In it, he demanded to be paid the same amount as Hulk Hogan, the company's single biggest star at the time and the highest paid performer by far. He said he would not perform in the main event of the show unless Vince agreed to his terms in writing, leaving Vince very little time to respond for the event. Vince signed the letter. He agreed to the demands, putting it in writing, with his own signature, under pressure, and with the clock running out for the show. But the moment Hellwig walked back through the curtain after finishing his match, having delivered exactly what was asked, Vince fired him on the spot, right there backstage, with the ink barely dry on the agreement they had just made. This exact same pattern, big promises followed almost immediately by sudden, silent firing, happened again with Hellwig in 1992, and then again in 1996. Almost as if the cycle simply could not be broken, no matter how many times played out. Each time, he would vanish from television without warning, often caught up in messy legal battles over who actually owned the rights to his character, his costume, and his entire on-screen identity. Fights that dragged on for years. These two stories show something important about how the company really worked underneath the surface, away from the bright lights. Inside WWE, crossing Vince McMahon on a personal level did not usually lead to a war that anyone could see from the side. It led to a door quietly closing somewhere behind the scene, with no announcement and no warning. And once that door closed, for most people, it almost never opened again, no matter how big a star they had once been. Stories like these became part of the unspoken history of the locker room, passed quietly between wrestlers as warning about what could happen if you ever pushed too hard against the office, no matter how big your name was on the market this time. Vince McMahon changed wrestling forever. That part of his story cannot be taken away, no matter what else is true about it. He took a small regional business and turned it into a global entertainment empire, something nobody before him ever managed to do, and something nobody has fully replaced since, even after everything that happened. But the story behind that empire is not just a story of genius and hard work, even though both of those things are real. It's the story of a man shaped by fear, who went on to build an entire system of fear around him, layer by layer, for decades, till the system and the man became almost impossible to separate. A man who tried to control everything he could possibly reach: his wrestlers, his rival, his own body, and even the recorded history of his own industry. In the end, same need for control could not survive contact with the outside world, with regulators, with sponsors, courts, and with people finally willing to speak after staying silent for so long. The very system Vince McMahon built to protect himself slowly became the system that brought him down completely in the end. He did not only build WWE. In many real and important ways, he became WWE itself. And when it all finally came crashing down, there was nothing left standing between him and the consequence of everything that happened away. For everyone involved, for the people who worked alongside him over the decades, some of whom spent their entire careers inside the world he created, his story will likely always carry two different meanings once. One meaning belongs to the empire he built. The other belongs to everything under. Both meanings are true, and neither one cancels the other out, no matter how the story gets told from here on.